And it's nice to join you virtually today. Thanks so much for having me. It's always interesting and inspiring to learn more about the great work that's happening up in the Bay Area. So we're always learning from all of the great initiatives up there, and excited to share a little bit about what's been happening down here in Santa Monica. So you can go to the next slide. So just a quick snapshot to provide some context for our work on this natural gas decommissioning pilot. In Santa Monica, from our last greenhouse gas emissions inventory, which we'll be updating soon, so we'll have some more current data, but we know that about a third of our emissions come from the building sector, and within those emissions, 23% come from natural gas burned in buildings. And so we've made some good strides in cleaning up our electricity, as with many other cities that we've heard from today, when we joined the Clean Power Alliance, our local community choice aggregator. And we have a 96% of customers within CPA are on the 100% clean power rate. So really, addressing that question of the incremental benefits of switching to electric appliances. You can go to the next slide. And so within the city's climate action and adaptation plan, we have our larger goal of getting to carbon neutrality by 2050 or sooner, and reaching 80% emissions reductions below our 1990 levels by 2030. And we recently adopted our all-electric building code, as many other cities that have shared today have as well. And that took effect in January of this year, requiring all new buildings to be fully electric. And then another goal within our climate action plan is to reduce fossil fuel use in existing buildings by 20% by 2030. And so Santa Monica recently released an equitable electrification roadmap, laying out potential strategies to reach some of these emissions reduction goals for existing buildings. And so we actually just started our first community workshop last week, where we'll be starting on developing policies to introduce benchmarking and building performance standards. And then this natural gas decommissioning pilot came along and really aligned well with a lot of our other work to try and figure out how we can really figure out how we're going to eventually decommission some of the natural gas lines within the city, and all of the logistics and steps that would be involved with that. And so you've heard a lot about this already, but so we are one of the cities partnering with RAND on the CEC proposal to support natural gas decommissioning. Long Beach is the other city. And I'll just cover briefly the CEC pilot goals to develop a framework to identify areas where natural gas can be decommissioned in Southern California, with priorities to serve the interests of affected communities, lead to economic and societal benefits, and also be plausible under a range of future conditions. And so the last community stakeholder workshop we held was in November, and we had tables that were broken out into groups by census tracts to kind of focus on specific areas within those census tracts and really take advantage of the local community knowledge of the city and building stock. We have done building stock analysis in partnership with Rocky Mountain Institute, which has provided some better context into the number of buildings over different square footage thresholds, and looking at the relationship between single family and multifamily, and the percentage of emissions that correspond to those different groups. But really what we focused on within the workshop was the site selection criteria and looking at the assessment tool that RAND developed with the criteria listed here. So we had different maps that overlaid the various criteria for different census tracts. So I can go back to the next slide just for a moment. And so those criteria were the pollution burden and which communities fell within the disadvantaged community designation, the age of the housing stock, the gas pipeline diameter, because specifically referring to the fact that it's cheaper to decommission smaller pipes that are closer to the end of the line, and then household income. And so this next slide, you'll see some of the workshop takeaways. And I'll go into some of these in a bit more detail, just giving some of the topics that came up at the workshop. But really, you'll see a bit of overlay with what Michelle just mentioned in the city of Albany. Definitely one of the areas that came up again and again is the equity considerations and what really is going to be involved with this transition and how we can reduce the energy cost burden, particularly given the volatility in energy prices lately. There was a lot of discussion about ways to mitigate those cost burdens on our low-income residents. We also talked about the importance of replicability and selecting a site that had that could be replicated in other parts of the city and elsewhere. We talked about the importance of resiliency and backup power, the difference between the capital and ongoing costs of shifting to all electric buildings. And also, we talked a lot about the resident experience of shifting to electrification. So really looking at how we can minimize disruption to occupants, also noting the potential for increased energy consumption with the conversion to heat pumps in buildings that previously did not have air conditioning, which is most buildings in Santa Monica and most coastal areas in general. So looking at how those cost impacts would need to be considered. We talked about the need to have a lot of community education, and also in terms of the tenant experience, what other costs could be covered by participation in the CEC grant, like tenant relocation costs, the need to replace cookware, the ability to add solar to the building to offset the load. And eventually the stakeholders from the workshop selected 3 sites, and 2 of these are in partnership with one of our local affordable housing developers, Community Core Santa Monica. So they own 2 of these sites that were selected. So one is a pretty large 90-unit apartment complex that's close to the 10 freeway. And then another one is a building, also pretty large, 60-unit building constructed in 1960, owned by Community Core Santa Monica. And then the third, the specific building hasn't been selected, but the criteria was to have a smaller building that's newer construction, but also closer to the freeway. And then I can dig into a couple other points that I didn't list here, but there was also discussion about selecting commercial versus residential buildings and discussing possible challenges with commercial buildings while recognizing that they still might offer valuable lessons. And most of our large building stock is commercial. When you look at the over 50,000 square feet buildings. And then we also discussed the options of including schools and community college campuses and the ability to take advantage of the schedules where you could do renovations during the summer to minimize disruption to students and staff when they weren't occupying the space for the majority of the time. We also talked about the ability or the decision between larger versus smaller residential buildings. So noting the fact that there's a potential for larger impact, of course, when you have more units, but it also means more people are affected. And many of the multifamily built residential buildings in Santa Monica do have 8 units or less. So we have a number of large ones, but the highest quantity of multifamily buildings are definitely the smaller multifamily. We talked about the age of buildings, so noting that older buildings would be more challenging and more expensive to decommission than newer ones. And there are many older buildings in the city. However, improvements in older buildings would lead to greater benefits to residents. For example, improving the indoor air quality. Another point that was brought up was how discussing the building codes and the extent that retrofits could trigger the need to bring buildings up to code, which could potentially make projects prohibitively expensive. And then we discussed freeway proximity, and selecting sites closer to freeways was really valued as a key criteria due to the higher environmental and health burdens that come from living close to the freeway and the criteria pollutants that residents are exposed to there. So the next steps, we're just waiting for the CEC to put out the call for proposals, which I hear should happen in the next month or two. And we'll continue to work with our project partners, so RAND and Community Corporation, once that proposal, call for proposals comes out. And yeah, Community Corp has been a really great partner, and they actually recently opened a fully electric new apartment building in Santa Monica, and they've been really looking at ways to tackle their existing building stock as well. And so we've had a lot of conversations with them about providing resources. We have a Electrify Santa Monica rebate program with increased rebate amounts for swapping out fuel appliances with electric, but rebate programs still have their challenges, of course, particularly for low-income residents, because you still have to put up that upfront capital before you get reimbursed. So hopefully we'll be able to add some programs in the future, like heat pump direct install, to try and tackle that piece. But this is where we're at in terms of this pilot. So I'll stop there. Thank you.